an outnumbered group of American soldiers, cut off beyond friendly lines, on 2 occasions, changed the course of the Korean War in one of the greatest regimental defense actions in military history. Now that should be a movie. Hello, and thank you for watching today's episode of That Should Be a Movie. I'm C.W. Johnson Jr. Today's historical event, which I would like to pitch as a movie, are the events surrounding the Korean War battles of the Twin Tunnels and Chipyong-ni, as recorded in High Tide in the Korean War, how an outnumbered American regiment defeated the Chinese at Chipyong-ni by Leo Barron from Stackpole Books, and Leadership in the Crucible, the Korean War battles of Twin Tunnels and Chipyong-ni by Kenneth E. Hamburger from Texas A&M University Press. In January and February 1951, a series of battles were fought in South Korea that turned back the tide of the Communist Chinese Army, which was poised to drive the United Nations forces back into the Pusan perimeter. These battles were fought around important crossroads and included the battles of Twin Tunnels, Chipyong-ni, and Waju. Despite the importance of these battles, there is very little literature on them. Besides the before-mentioned books, the only ones I could get my hands on, there is also Chipyong-ni by Office of the Chief Military History, Crossroads in Korea, The Historic Siege of Chipyong-ni by T.R. Fehrenbach, Waju, The Gettysburg of the Korean War by J.D. Coleman, and The Line, Combat in Korea, January-February 1951 by William T. Bowers. Part 9 of The Coldest Winter, America and the Korean War by David Halberstam has a good summary of the campaign and was where I first heard of these battles. Of the 2 books I have, Leadership in the Crucible is more didactic, while High Tide in the Korean War is more of a play-by-play of the battle. Hamburger's book starts off with the international issues that led to the war, with a Sparks Notes edition of the conflict up to January 1951, and the backstory of the primary members of the U.S. 23rd Infantry Regiment. He follows the 23rd as they land at Pusan, march up the Korean Peninsula, and after a desperate fight at Konari, escape the Chinese invasion of November 1951, the only regiment still fit for combat in the Indian Head Division. He also uses the actions and attitudes of the good officers like Paul L. Freeman Jr. and the French officer Ralph Montclair, as compared to less liked officers like Ned Alman, to illustrate lessons on good leadership. Barron's book is more action-oriented, as the majority of its pages are dedicated to the regiment's actions at Twin Tunnels and Chipyong-ni. By sectioning each chapter with heads containing the military dates and times and locations of different units, Barron creates an atmosphere that puts us right in the conflict as he cites veterans' descriptions of the weather, the terrain, the military culture, the heroics of their comrades, the cries of the wounded, the actions of the enemy, and the effect of American arms, booby traps, fire, and air power upon them. Barron writes that when he first heard of the battles, he thought that the central elements of the story were right out of a Hollywood blockbuster. A single U.S. Army infantry regiment found itself trapped behind enemy lines, facing several Chinese army divisions. Despite the long odds, The 23rd Infantry, together with its detached French battalion, whipped the Chinese division and altered the course of the Korean War. The story itself was tailor-made for a great movie. Like him, I also asked myself why more people haven't heard about the Battle of Chipyong-ni and why there hasn't been a movie. The background of the battle is the Korean War in January 1951. The Chinese have forced the United Nations back into South Korea, pushing them to within almost 100 miles of the Pusan perimeter and recapturing Seoul in the third battle for that city. Having captured so much ground so quickly, the Chinese had to stop and allow their supply lines to catch up. While the Communists were regrouping, the Americans were also reorganizing as the new commander, the 8th United States Army, General Matthew Ridgway, a replacement for the deceased Walton Walker, installed fresh confidence in his men. He knew that the Chinese must be stopped quickly before they could launch another offensive. I don't want to hear your withdrawal plans. I want to hear your attack plans, he told his staff. Besides from being a fighter who brought order out of chaos, he was also a well-liked commander who watched out for the comfort of the average soldier, making sure they had plenty of hot meals. There is a sharp contrast between Ridgway's command style and that of ex-corps commander Major General Edward M. Allman, who would talk down to the common soldier and was generally disliked by all. These two commanders oversaw Operation Thunderbolt. The purpose of Operation Thunderbolt was to capture the Central Corridor in northern South Korea to keep the Chinese from launching another offensive. The key to holding this area was the crossroads of Chipyong-ni. Since the Chinese did not use the roads, the Americans had to send out patrols to probe the area and find them. This assignment fell to the 23rd Infantry Regiment, 2nd Infantry Division, commanded by Colonel Paul L. Freeman Jr. Freeman was so popular with his men that they would try to grow mustaches and wear scarves and hats instead of helmets like he did. The prelude to the Battle of Chipyong-ni starts on January 29, 1951. Charlie Company is sent on a reconnaissance mission in the area south of the Chipyong-ni crossroads. Freeman had many concerns about the patrol. They would have to use the same road entering and leaving the area after crossing a river, which could easily be blocked. This fear was confirmed when the Chinese cut the patrol off at the ford. Almost everything that could go wrong went wrong. The captain disappeared with the radio and was later found dead. Overcast skies interfered with the visibility of the reconnaissance plane, and when the lead vehicle broke down, the whole column was stopped. The column had to abandon most of their weapons when they rushed to the high ground of a nearby hill, which the Chinese were also racing toward. The Americans won the race to the frozen hilltop and established a defensive position. 9 men, green replacements, didn't hear the command in confusion and remained in a ditch where 7 of them were killed. One was a newlywed who hadn't finished paying for the wedding ring he was wearing. There was a Private Alan G. Anderson who returned to the column of vehicles to get his rifle. The Chinese rushed him, and he fought them in hand-to-hand combat until killed. He would be awarded a posthumous Silver Star. The remaining 50 men on the hill, under command of James P. Mitchell, fought bravely against a force that was over 1,000 strong. They fought valiantly, reserving their ammunition until the Chinese were in range, sometimes as close as 10 feet, before opening fire. When the Chinese threw grenades into the perimeter, the Americans threw them back. Private Bill Horton, a rifleman from Texas, braved enemy fire to save his comrades. At one point, he rushed through a maelstream of bullets to silence an enemy machine gun. As he returned to his lines, a hidden machine gun opened fire, killing him. He would receive a posthumous Silver Star. Corporal Jesus A. Sanchez from Fox Company, 21st Infantry, brought to the assault by single-handedly killing several communists. A lone soldier from Dahl Company, PFC Thomas J. Mortimer, charged and used his bayonet to slay the lead communist and chase the rest away. He would receive a Silver Star. Lieutenant Mitchell ordered his wounded men, not them all, to keep the Chinese from knowing their number of casualties. When an airplane dropped the message that help was on the way, he crawled around the perimeter, telling the men the encouraging news. But even when American planes dropping supplies to them and napalm bombs on the enemy, the men of Charlie Company had to hold on despite mounting casualties and shrinking ammo supplies. Freeman ordered Fox Company, under command of Captain Stanley C. Terrell, to go to the relief of Charlie Company. Named the Fighting Foxes because of their defense of the so-called Taegu bowling alley, these men showed a bravery equal to that of the companies they were relieving. A radio operator, PFC James E. Robinson, ran messages alone in the dark through enemy territory after his radio had been destroyed. He would be awarded the Silver Star. With no radio, the only way Captain Terrell knew about the state of Company C was through survivors like Corporal Leroy Gibbons, who had snuck through enemy lines to guide the relief force. When Terrell's column approached the hilltop, someone shouted, "Who won the Rose Bowl?" Someone in the relief column replied, "Fox Company, 2nd Infantry, by God." Charlie Company had been relieved. Of the 60 men who went out with the patrol, only 12 returned unscathed. 13 were dead, 5 were missing, 30 were wounded. Yet, because of their stand, the Americans now knew where the enemy was and could attack them. This assignment fell to Paul Freeman in the 23rd Regiment, who moved out on January 31st, 1951. Freeman was unhappy with General Ullman's order to advance 10 miles beyond the front lines and out of range of artillery support. His orders were to occupy the high ground north of the railroad tunnels known as Twin Tunnels. Knowing how the Chinese attacked columns on the road and at night, Freeman made the wise choice to have his men march along the ridges, fortify hills and other high ground before moving onward. His progress was too slow for Ullman, who in a rage ordered Brigadier General George C. Stewart to fire on the village of Chipyong-ni. Stewart reluctantly fired a few rounds over the village. Freeman was angry at Ullman, not just for this breach of the chain of command, but also because it alert the Chinese to his presence. Freeman had known that he was smack dab in front of the advance of 3 Chinese regiments, about 8,000 strong, outnumbering him 3-1. He would have been even more furious. The Chinese attacked the next day, February 1st, at 4:30 a.m. "Knew this was going to happen," Freeman said to Stewart. "What do you want me to do now?" The only thing they could do was stay put and kill as many Chinese as possible. White phosphorus lights flickered in the fog, and the sounds of bugles and whistles marked the Chinese arrival. Some U.S. soldiers were hesitant to fire, since some Chinese wore American uniforms, or marched like refugees to confuse them. Some outlying posts were wiped out. By 700 hours, the Chinese had infiltrated the American lines and achieved breakthroughs, resulting in the Americans fighting in hand-to-hand combat in some places, and falling back in others. Men were forced to abandon their foxholes as the Reds rolled potato masters into them. The two sides were so close that they tossed grenades just as often as they fired their rifles. Men called down fire on their own positions. The French battalion, which was attached to the 23rd Regiment under command of Ralph Montclair, also had a rough fight. A Lieutenant Louis Lacroix had sustained an abdominal wound, but would keep fighting for the next 13 hours. First Sergeant Paul Eman led 13 men in Lieutenant Claude L. Japart's fierce counterattack and was seriously injured. An even worse development had occurred. The skies were now overcast with black clouds, denying the Americans and French air cover. By midday, the Chinese were so close to the regimental command post that three-man staff clerks had to dash through ricocheting and errant bullets while passing papers. Stuart received a call from a Major General Clark Ruffner, who asked for updates every 30 minutes. Standing in a pool of blood belonging to the radio operator who had just been killed, Stuart held the phone out the door so Ruffner could hear the fighting. The enemy had taken important hills, and Freeman was ordering counterattacks to retake them. By mid-afternoon, Freeman, Stuart, and Montclair gathered all the ammunition they could find and prepared to make a final last stand. Then, a patch of blue appeared above them, and in a moment that Freeman later said was too unbelievable even for a Hollywood movie, a flight of Marine Corsairs zoomed the breaks in the clouds. Heedless of unseen mountaintops, they dropped 500-pound bombs into the closely packed human waves of the communists and mowed them down with machine guns. The enemy fled, leaving behind 3,600 of the 8,000 who had attacked. Freeman's much smaller force had sustained casualties of 225 killed, wounded, and missing. There are many examples of bravery at Twin Tunnels. 3rd Battalion and the French Battalion would receive Presidential Unit Citations. A lone forward observer in Item Company, Thomas C. Harris, continued his duty of calling down fire missions despite being hit in the foot. Sergeant William A. Sanford followed orders and rushed through enemy fire to find a comrade. Despite being wounded in the arm, he crawled up a hill and killed 2 Chinese with burp guns who had infiltrated the line. He would receive the Silver Star. PFC George R. Van Stryver III would also receive the Silver Star for carrying wounded men from the battlefield and killing several of the enemy with a bayonet. A Hawaiian, PFC Arthur Canaglio, covered his men's retreat as he tossed grenades at the surging communists. He would receive a posthumous Silver Star. When Sergeant Herbert L. Lee's platoon leader was killed, he took charge and 5 times led charges to take positions from the enemy. Despite being hit with 2 blasts from grenades, which left fragments in his injured leg, and being struck with small arms fire, Lee continued firing from his knees until his comrades had retaken the hill. He would receive the Medal of Honor. The work for Freeman and the 23rd was not done. They were ordered to advance to Chipyong-ni and hold the transportation hub to protect the flank of the 10th Corps as it launched its offensive, Operation Roundup. What the Americans did not know was that the Chinese were also planning an offensive. 2 Chinese divisions would be ordered to cut off the American regiment at Chipyong-ni and destroy it. As Freeman, the 23rd and the French waited at the crossroads. They were joined by a combat engineer company, the 82nd Anti-Aircraft Artillery Battalion, and a battery of 15 MMs manned by a segregated black unit, 503rd Field Artillery Battalion's Baker Company. They were also joined by the 1st Ranger Company, which was better suited for hit and run raids than fence. Freeman also had the regiment strengthen their lines and plant booby traps in the areas in front of their positions, like mines and tripwires. Some of the traps were fog gases, cans planted in holes dug in the ground that were then filled with gasoline and then pointed towards the approaching enemy. By February 12th, it became clear to Ridgway that Operation Roundup was a failure. He ordered his forces to fall back and regroup, all except the 23rd, a regiment he knew could stay and fight. He hoped that the communist advance would batter itself to a halt against their position. "We're surrounded, but we'll stay here and fight it out," Freeman told his men, who greeted the news with enthusiasm. One sergeant declared that the Chinese had just started digging their own graves. The Chinese attacked on the night of February 13th. Signal lights, bugles, and whistles announcing their arrival. They yelled Montage and tried to push Bangalore torpedoes, long pipes filled with explosives, through the American lines to blow up the barbed wire defenses. The Chinese also had artillery, which rained down inside of the perimeter, setting American half-tracks on fire, which silhouetted the Americans, giving the enemy a better target. Because the Americans were completely surrounded, they could only be reinforced by airdrop. The question became, will the Americans run out of ammunition, or the Chinese out of bodies first? The Americans fought back bravely. A bazooka team crawled forward and took out a Chinese machine gun. With their support by fire gone, the Chinese attack collapsed. Men waited until the enemy was almost on top of them before opening fire. Others preferred to toss grenades, so the flash of their rifles wouldn't give away their position. The French battalion cranked up an air raid alarm to unnerve the Chinese and disrupt their communication system with bells and whistles. They lured the Chinese into ambushes by pretending to retreat, and then attacked like wild men, wielding machetes, axes, knives, and clubs. At some places the fighting became hand-to-hand combat. These are not your stereotypical French. American Lieutenant Charles H. Davison ran back and forth with ammo, refusing medical aid despite grenade wounds. Corporal Roland J. Jarvie crawled out of his foxhole to find a better firing position to fight off an outflanking attack. Despite wounds from grenades, mortar rounds, and bullets, he kept plugging away until he was killed. PFC William G. Mason ran much needed ammunition to his machine gun team despite a gauntlet of enemy fire. PFC Lawrence and Kea waited until a group of communists were almost on top of him before opening fire with his bar gun. He killed 16 of them before crawling out of his hole and getting a better position on them, driving them off by firing from the hip. Sergeant First Class George H. Glassman was resupplying his men when he found a hole in the line and personally plugged it by driving off 20 enemy soldiers. Sergeant Leo Bevins skirted an enemy attack and opened fire with his rifle, taking out 17 Red soldiers. All of them would receive the Silver Star. By morning, the fighting has slackened. From prisoners captured by the French, Freeman learned that he was facing elements of 5 Chinese divisions with a total strength of 30,000 men. Later, when trying to get some rest, a mortar went off near Freeman, hitting him just above the ankle with shrapnel. The medic who examined the wound said that under normal circumstances, he would be evacuated. But these were no normal circumstances, and he would not recommend evacuation. However, when General Ned Allman learned of Freeman's wound, he sent a replacement officer. This was probably due to personal animosity between the two officers. Freeman was furious, since it was a disgrace and demoralizing to the men for a commander to be replaced before a fight was through, and refused to be evacuated. There was more bad news. It was forecast that there would be 9 straight hours of rough weather that would ground the supply aircraft, Japan, and on the offshore carriers. The Americans were winning a great victory at Wanzhou on the same day, with a tremendous display of air power. But unfortunately for the 23rd, this meant that few planes could be spared to support or supply them. Even when supplies were dropped, some would be damaged upon landing. As night fell on February 14th, the Americans could see the Chinese coming out of hiding and forming up. They heard their bugle calls and other forms of communication. Then, wave after wave of communists crashed against the perimeter. The Chinese used small arms fire and grenades to keep the GIs down, as others used poles to push satchel charges through the barbed wire and into the foxholes of the Americans. The Chinese used captured American artillery pieces and ammunition. Green and red tracers arced through the sky as U.S. airplanes dropped flares to light up the outside of the perimeter. Gun barrels glowed red as they burned out. The artillerymen of Baker Company and the Rangers were forced to fight like infantrymen. Every time a Bangalore blew a hole in the wire, the Chinese poured through. By 3 in the morning, the Chinese had captured the important McGee and Curtis Hills. 2nd Lieutenant Paul J. McGee and Sergeant Billy C. Klutz, commander of 3rd Battalion, George Company, and a few survivors fought their way off the hill. According to Lieutenant McGee, the men who stayed in their foxholes were heroes. Privates Burl J. Mace, Paul C. Baker, and Bruce M. Boyles stayed in their holes and fought to the death, their bodies surrounded by those of the enemy. Corporal Hal McGovern was manning his machine gun when the Chinese surged past him. He ordered his team to retreat and cover them by firing his light machine gun like it was a rifle. His blistering fuselage saved his comrades' lives, but not his own. Private Paul Stamper ran around the battleground, repairing the signal wire so the platoons could communicate, only stopping to destroy a red machine gun team with a grenade. Private Albert H. Hinger jumped on an abandoned machine gun, mowing down wave after wave of communists. Private Richard L. Sivik continued to return to the hill to carry injured comrades to the aid station, even after the Chinese had captured some of the hill. Private Delmore Patton from Ohio was an ammo bearer, but when he saw wounded men returning from the ridgeline, he grabbed his rifle and headed up to help plug holes in the line. They would all receive posthumous silver stars. PFC Harry L. Nass covered 300 meters open ground 4 times to retrieve 2 .30 caliber machine guns, not even letting a wound stop him. PFC William D. Gillian from Iowa dashed out into the open to repair a break in the wires from the command post. He also carried a wounded comrade and ammo across open ground. Corporal Joe E. Halbrook led his unit of Filipino Americans and a Korean on a mission to destroy enemy mortars. Despite enemy tracers filling the air around him, he used a recoilless rifle to destroy the mortars. He covered his men's withdrawal with his recoilless rifle, 2 grenades, and his carbine until a wound forced him to retire. PFC Leslie E. Alston was a jeep driver who raced through enemy fire to help replace broken machine guns while carrying ammunition to other soldiers and rescuing the wounded. They would all receive silver stars. Corporal Eugene L. Oysting, whose body was never found, would be rewarded a silver star in absentia. Clutch and McGee would also earn the silver star for their leadership of 3rd Platoon. Such bravery was shown by both sides along the line that night. After the first wave of communist attackers had been exterminated, the second wave would come, pick up their guns, and continue the charge. An American soldier in Item Company, SFC William S. Sitman, would be given the Medal of Honor for holding off the Chinese with a machine gun until a grenade landed in his foxhole on which he threw himself, saving the lives of his comrades. In the Ramsburg Bowl, 5 hours of combat reduced Thomas Heath's G Company to the size of a platoon. Sergeant Kalawa B. Martinez took charge and led F Company in an attempt to retake Curtis Hill. When he realized that his men would be killed by mortars falling into their position if they stayed there, he jumped up and, despite being hit in the face by shell fragments, led the men by example. His company and the Rangers would suffer horrendous casualties from the interlocking fire of the enemy. PFC Cell E. Van Dern volunteered to remain behind to provide covering fire with his Grand until his comrades had escaped. PFC Clifford Logan ran through enemy fire several times to rescue wounded soldiers from McGee Hill. They would all receive Silver Stars. Captain John L. Ramsburg stopped a soldier dragging a wounded Lieutenant Heath down the hill, telling him that they needed every able-bodied man at the front. The soldier turned and showed him that his other arm was hanging loosely by strips of flesh. Ramsburg let him continue down the hill, then gathered every warm body he could find: mortarmen, wiremen, cooks, radiomen, clerks, and placed them on the line. The battle became a matter of survival and was described by many as a grenade fight. Officers ordered that arms be destroyed so as not to fall into the hands of the Chinese. Under the cover of artillery fire, the Americans tried to retake McGee, Curtis, and Smith Hills. A replacement officer, Lieutenant Herschel Hawk Chapman, insisted on taking part in the counterattack despite having a $1 million wound. Every time the men in these suicidal counterattacks rose up the charge, the Chinese would cut them down in their tracks, and they would have to throw themselves into the snow for protection. Due to the proximity of the enemy, the charges would be made without artillery support, for fear it would hit comrades. Some American air support, which flew so low it disappeared behind the hills, would be so close napalm would land on the Americans, but their heavy clothing would keep it from burning their skin. At Heath Ridge, Sergeant Joe R. Merez continued to fire his 60mm mortar tube, despite being the only man in his team unwounded. Even after he was wounded, he continued firing despite incoming fire. He would receive the Silver Star. Colonel Edward decided he would outflank the hills and ordered the regiment's tanks to head down the highway on which the Americans had planted mines earlier. To remove these mines, the Ranger Company attacked as infantry. The first 3 men to make it through the minefield, Corporals Ernest C. Lawson Jr. and George P. Monhall Jr. and PFC Keith C. Karnowski, would receive Silver Stars. Captain George E. von Thun, the commander of the tanks, who refused to be evacuated despite a wound, would receive one as well. Around noon, Colonel Freeman obeyed his orders and left the perimeter. His eyes glistened with tears as he approached the helicopter. Colonel Edward later admitted lying to Freeman, telling him that the Chinese penetration had been eliminated. Because he knew that if Freeman knew there was still a threat, he would never have left and would have been court-martialed. Freeman's replacement showed good judgment and let Lieutenant Colonel Mazar control operations, since he had a better sense of what was going on. Later, Freeman wrote to the soldiers of the 23rd, praising their conduct during the battle. His men showed him the same respect. It did not hold his evacuation against him. Meanwhile, just 6 miles away, rescue was coming in the form of the 5th Cavalry, the Black Knights of the 1st Cavalry Division. Their commander, Colonel Marcel G. Crobez was an opinionated, stubborn man who alienated many, yet always got the job done. Under his command was Lieutenant Colonel Edgar J. Tracy Jr., commander of the 3rd Battalion. Crobez had a conflicted relationship with him, with Crobez's jealousy of him being extended to the whole battalion. Crobez's column had been slowly advancing up the Chipyong-ni highway, being stopped by blown bridges and 2,000 Chinese entrenched on the ridges which lined the route. The 1st and 2nd Battalions had been moving along the ridges, clearing them of the enemy presence, while the 3rd was in reserve. When Crobez received word that the Americans at Chipyong-ni were in desperate straits, he made a crucial decision. His Patton and Sherman tanks would fly down the road. On their roofs, the men of the 3rd Battalion would ride, and whenever enemy resistance was met, jump off, eliminate it, and jump back on the tanks. Tracy saw a disaster in the making, and despite Crobez's orders for him to stay behind, went with his men by hitching a ride in a truck. It was a hellish ride for the infantry. A slugfest ensued as the Chinese used U.S. weapons abandoned earlier in the winter against the column, and the Americans turned the rice paddies, from which the Red soldiers fired, in the funeral plots. Every time the tanks were stopped by the interlocking fire of the Chinese machine guns and rocket launchers on the high ground, usually at bends and cuts in the road, the soldiers were forced to dismount and eliminate the enemy. Then, through a lack of communication and Crobez's insistence that speed was of the essence, many of the men were left behind as the tanks zipped off. Soldiers were shot by the enemy as they climbed back onto the tanks, or were accidentally knocked off by the gun turrets or blown off by concussions from the firing. One of those men left behind was Lieutenant Colonel Tracy, as he helped a wounded soldier despite his own flesh wound near the mouth. The column was passing a road cut just to the south of Chipyong-ni when the Chinese started exploding pole charges near the tanks. One tank was hit by a bazooka, killing everyone inside except the driver, who, despite being seriously injured, gunned the tank through the cut so the column would not be held up. Soon after, the column became visible to all in the Chipyong-ni Valley. It was a great morale boost to the UN forces as French troops ran and kissed the tanks. For the Chinese, it was a great psychological and physical blow. They broke and ran for the hills, abandoning their dead, wounded, and weapons, and ignoring the orders of the political commissars. Seeing 2 Chinese armies in retreat, the Americans opened up with everything they had: air, artillery, machine gun, and small arms fire. It was a complete and total victory. The Americans lost less than 500 men, while the Chinese casualties were over 3,000. Sadly, of the 164 infantrymen and engineers who left with Crobez's column, only 23 were still in the tanks when they pulled into the perimeter. 13 of the wounded, 1 fatally. Of the 100 soldiers left strung along the highway through enemy territory, 20 were killed, 20 captured, and 40 wounded. One of those captured was Tracy, who would later die in a POW camp from an illness he contracted due to giving his rations to weaker fellow prisoners. His men believed he deserved the Medal of Honor. However, Crobez, who received the Distinguished Service Cross, refused to go through with the recommendation due to personal resentment. The fight at Chipyong-ni was one of the greatest battles in the Korean War, and important ones in American history. It ended the advance of the Chinese army south of the 38th parallel, saved the nation of South Korea and boosted the confidence of the American Army. The tactics practiced there would be used as standard by the American military for many years to come, especially during Vietnam. I believe this battle should be portrayed in a major film production in order for the American people to remember the price of freedom and those by whom it was paid. I believe this would honor those who served there, from the Americans like Paul J. Freeman, Herbert L. Lee, Paul J. McGee, Stanley C. Terrell, John H. Ransburg, and Arthur Quinonio, the French Battalion, Ralph McQuarrie, Gennard Jornet, and Paul Amiot, the pilots who risked their lives for the men on the ground, who they didn't even know, and even the common Chinese soldier. One person who I especially think should be honored is Lieutenant Colonel Edgar J. Tracy, Jr., because it would preserve the legacy of an important battle for freedom and honor those who sacrificed there. I believe that the events surrounding the Battle of Chipyong-ni, as recorded in Leadership in the Crucible by Kenneth E. Hamburger and High Tide in the Korean War by Leo Barron, should be a movie. Thank you for watching. Please like and subscribe and share with your friends. Then let me know in the comment section what story you think should be a movie that honors our veterans.